a couple in particular come into this stay ahead of the story. And I think that's what it's called. I'm trying to remember now. um, yeah, get ahead of the story. Mention that. One thing about getting ahead of the story, I want to talk about media relations and not only that, being able to shape your narrative, because that's one of the most important things is staying ahead of what the narrative is saying by mediated resources, but also being able to interact with them effectively, and also making sure that you're the one that shapes the narrative in terms of your own business. So a couple of things in terms of the best practices. First, I want to talk a little bit about structures of reports for how crisis can unfold in this case. So, in many cases, we get a lot of uh, initial parts that we don't understand. I talked a lot about uncertainty reductions, but this there's a really good case study that talked about this. It was a journal article, but they mentioned a very specific example with the Oklahoma City bombing of how this works, and I'd like to kind of share this with you, talking about the type of response here. So, within this response of mediated relations, first is chapter one, which is called shock and response. Details, and so this is the part of the Oklahoma City bombing for shock and response. Details of the chaotic aftermath and the final hours of the bombing from 9:02 a.m. to 11:22 a.m. and the response of each of the departments within the city of Oklahoma City. So again, shock and response. That's a big part of crises. We've mentioned this before. As part as unexpected. It's always unexpected to everybody, and because of that, we're going to try to make sense of this as much as possible. So there is a big role the media plays, mediated resources play in this case, is that they want to be on the scene because their job is to make sure that they put out information for the general public to see, so that they're informed as well. So this was. In a lot of these cases, for like a bombing, you might have a family or friend in these scenarios. And so having a news report is very, very helpful in terms of understanding it as it unfolds. So you could think of any mass shooting or any mass bombing in this case where that has happened, whether it be, um, Sandy Hook, for instance, or, um, the Boston Marathon bombing, for instance. These are all variables to where we were like, yeah, there's a lot of people involved. So there's a lot of shock, and we have to evaluate that quickly. Next is terms of taking control, and this is probably one of the most beneficial ones for an organization to do here. Describes the planning and coordination of the city of Oklahoma City in the rescue and recovery efforts at the Marah bombing site at 11:22 a.m. to midnight. Um, so that's the other thing. So not only do we have this to say, look, we understand that this is happening, it's horrible, um, and I'm having trouble reading Oklahoma City and City. Um, so this is awful, right? But at the same time, now we're going to do things to make sure that people are safe and the debris and rubble is cleared, etc. Then we get into resource escalation. So far we've done shock and response, taking control, and this is resource escalation. So details the particular operation from April 20th and 21st, which concentrated on the communication among officials and gathering personnel and resources for the rescue and recovery efforts, to support a lengthy operation. So this is more of being able to explain why. So it's not so much that this is our plan. Now we plan to do it. And now here are the specifics. This is one of the things that I try to tell you within your apologia is if you're going to apologize and you're going to say, I'm going to have, um, what do we call it? Corrective action. Then what are those resources that you are going to provide to make sure that happens? And this is another reason why I had you put like a timeline in with everything there to make sure that we can understand this is what you plan to do in that respect. So chapter 4. Okay, so we have gotten through shock and response, taking control, resource escalation. Now is sustaining the effort. So sustaining the effort describes the time period of April 22nd through 29th, including the work to sustain and coordinate a rescue operation with body identification process, criminal investigation, and broadening programs to care for victims and families. Okay, so yeah, one thing we might mention at that point in terms of sustaining the effort here is that we see things like body identification process. So this was actually a big conversation in a crisis in Hillsborough. This was regarding a soccer match or football match, wherever you're from, that talked about Liverpool and how 96 fans were crushed, suffocated, and died. And it took years, almost decades, um, for this to be looked into in terms of a criminal investigation for the people that were the police chiefs in England, because this was a major tragedy, and this was something that could have been prevented, but it was just something that it was overcrowding was the problem in this one, and I ought to show you this for crisis purposes. It is very heavy, but it is something that really gets into how the police controlled their narrative in the wrong way, which is they just flat out lied. So maybe I'll try to get on that and show that to you, because that's a really interesting case study. Horrifying, but still very interesting. So, okay, we did sustaining the effort, and then comes recovering, healing, and remembrance. You usually see this a lot when it comes to local news, is these recovery processes to say, okay, now that the dust has settled, in some cases quite literally, and, we have made our conviction, made our our findings and so forth. Now we can go into remembrance. Now we can go into memoriam. You actually, it's really interesting that comes up, because a lot of this we'll talk about, like, how certain news organizations will sit there and go, well, we need to grieve before we do any of this first, which in reality is quite the opposite, because one of the things we find is you need to resolve uncertainty before you start the grieving process here. In this case, so features a year-long. So for Oklahoma City here, features a year-long official transition from a rescue operation to a recovery operation from April 30th, 1995 to March 1st, 1996. So that's a full year. Details the recovery of the bodies that were yet unaccounted for, and the shrines and mementos and on-site memorials that were developed. This is a hospital. Examines the support teams to set up for personnel and family, along with the aid of facilities and organization household in the Marab building. So again, all this is based on what occurs and how this works, and so you can actually get a pretty decent sense of how media organizations are going to cover the crisis in hand. So I want to talk about two things with that. First is this is the good article by Sherry Vale in terms of how to use best practices when talking to media. And I also want to talk just a fair bit about one of the Lanny Davis stories of when we don't use that, when we, because there should be two instances where we work with media organizations, or we can't work with a media organization because we're being accused of something. So let's talk about that for a second. So 5 best practices here is organization. Okay, so first one, organizations forthcoming with information are less likely to be targeted by media and public for wrongdoing. So this is Seeger 2006. Huge here. It suggests that organizations should engage in media throughout open and honest communication. And honestly, when that comes into play, you should be communicating with media resources when things are good, when things are boring, and have media contacts ready to go. This is one of the reasons why in crisis plans, I have you had those down. Have media contacts written down, because it's a good thing to kind of keep in touch. Um, one of my buddies who works in public relations says I have one of my journalists on speed dial, and to the point where I call him, like I would like extended family. Like every other week, I'll call them and say, "Hey, do you want to do lunch or something like that?" And just catch up, and that's kind of the thing that if the schedules align. But being able to, especially if your organization is a big part of the civic community, being able to talk to that organization is a really, really big deal, and staying ahead of that is a really, really big deal. So always make sure to be open and honest. So this is risk assessment that you're not being targeted in the first place. So keep that in mind. The second is media can be used not only as an information resource, but also a resource manager in crisis response. So this kind of gets into a little bit of the media is able to deliver messages, including instructing and adjusting information through news stories. So the big thing is that when we start to look at media relations, sometimes it's not a liability as it's often portrayed as. Sometimes it's an opportunity because, a small thing of um, this particular industry or this particular organization is doing everything they can right now to resolve the issue. They're being very cooperative with us. Having that information is really good. So that's big. Number three, organizations should remain accessible to the media throughout the crisis response. This is huge. Anytime that you're going through a crisis response, make sure that you are always talking with the people that need to be talked to, especially as if we go back to number two, is that is a resource manager of a crisis response. If they can help you in this case, then this is all the more reason why to be accessible and talk with them as you go through. So that's number three. Number four, partnerships in which both parties trust the other, not to take advantage of the situation in supportive environments. So partnership with media is encouraged of sharing information, energy, and resources, and having a collaborative advantage. Um, and it's established when risks are minimized through kind of identity-based trust, because when local medias and city of officials together are part of a community, the automated assumption was that everybody's going to do the right thing. So when we're all working together, it's kind of assumed that everybody's going to try to work together to make sure that whatever's most important, which in this case is human lives, which for the most part, this is what we're talking about within crisis. Um, you know, this is why Pepsi got out so easily and so well, was because media resources were sitting there going, man, they did everything that we told them to do, and this partnership actually worked. Especially since none of them were taking advantage of each other, to make a swift end to it and actually realize it was a hoax. And then the last thing, number five, establishing relationships with the media before a crisis allows for easy communication during the crisis. Again, this goes back to what we had mentioned with number one, is if you are communicating within the crisis or before it, then it's so much easier to bring up a contact here. And one of the reasons I bring these five things up is because when it comes to the chapter on landing duties, specifically within Dan Snyder and the Washington Redskins, um, to be formally named the formerly known as the Washington Redskins. I found this one in particular interesting because when I first saw it in a crisis book, I was like, this is definitely going to be about the name of demeaning names for Native American mascots, and that Native Americans shouldn't be mascots. However, it wasn't, and I was kind of surprised by that, and now I was like, now I'm even more intrigued to see what's being said because of what I expected versus what I got. There's a particular was this, it was kind of interesting, this A through Z list about problems with DC and Dan Snyder. The reason I'm bringing this up is that in a lot of cases, when we get into journalistic practices, things can take off quickly, and being able to be one step ahead of the game is key, especially if media relations are not in your support. So what I just mentioned is if you can cooperate together. What if you can't, though? So mentioning this, they wrote an A, B, C list of all the bad things about Dan Snyder, going through A through Z. Um, one of the things that was mentioned was some fraudulent charges through a telecommunications uh, aspect within what Dan Snyder did. Well, Lanny Davis puts it in and says, if you took 5 minutes and started to actually research this, you can actually determine that what was said was a lie. And this is on grounds of defamation, more specifically libel. And if you don't know what libel is, just a quick statement here is that these are false and damaging reports towards a person's reputation. False is key here, because if these things were actually true, then this was the kind of thing where that could present a huge problem, and you couldn't do anything about it. But there's also limitations for false reporting, such as if it's written in parody, you can't sue for libel or defamation. There's a lot of artistic narrative that comes into play when it comes to that. So it's very, very hard to prove a defamation case and win a suit on that case. Because the other thing is you have to prove that your reputation was damaged, usually by monetary purposes, that you lost money in this case. So in the case of Dan Snyder, again, through this telecommunications fraudulent charge scheme here, it turned out that it really was out of context. And if you did the research, that no, this was actually a false report. So Lanny Davis decided to file suit against the person who wrote the article. And so this is very denial-based apologia, right? And also categoria, which is attacking that person. And so those two instances actually bring in an interesting point. Now, he comes in and says, this is how I plan to suit for defamation. But at the same time, he pulled back the case there. But it mentions a couple of different things with pulling the suit here. First is, again, staying on top of the narrative, saying, hey, you can't just say this crap about Dan Snyder in this particular area. There are other areas you can criticize him for that you wouldn't be able to get in trouble for, but this in particular, this is something you can't do. So staying on top of that, letting people know that, hey, this is something that you can't do. But it also kind of gets into if there's a domino effect. Like if someone were to say, yeah, you're right, this person, Dan Snyder, not a good dude. And, not only in his team, but his resilience for keeping Native American mascots as a name. But also, this fraudulent charge scheme, all these things can come into play. There are unit relationships here to where people might back off in general because of those unit relationships, to where they say you can't charge somebody on this because this is actually not true. So part of this is, again, keeping messages simple, being very specific about what those messages are. But the other thing to consider here is to make sure when you're going into crisis is stay ahead of the story and be the narrative. You should be the most interesting thing when it comes to this news story in general. This is actually something that was taught to me by a journalist that said, you are not, because as a journalist, you're not supposed to be interesting. You're supposed to be the catalyst. The person that you're interviewing is the person who's supposed to be interesting. And that applies here. So if you are an organization, you need to make sure that you take advantage of that. Part of it is staying on task with good risk assessment strategies of talking to media companies before things break. But there are some things where it's like it would never be able to understand why this would happen the way that it is. How do you construct the message before then? Things like disgruntled employees. I've worked in one of the things that I do a lot of consulting work is in the video game industry, and there have been a couple of instances where disgruntled employees did something really detrimental to the company. So Naughty Dog Industries had a person that took the game The Last of Us 2 that just came out, and spoiled a bunch of stuff because they were really pissed of how they were treated. which brought up a big stir. How do you respond to it? Same thing with Riot Games, um, where they had some sexual harassment issues, and a lot of female employees just flat out walked out and went on strike at Riot. Which, interestingly, though, Riot, in many respects, uh, did so in such a way that they let them protest and let them resolve it within. In this case, now things aren't like completely hunky dory there, but I know a couple people that do work there, and mentioning that the relations, the public, or excuse me, the human resources and relationships have gotten a lot better when it comes to treatment of women in that particular industry, which is a positive thing. Especially when you consider how big Riot is as an organization, and it is global. So, having these best practices in place are are very needed in this particular instance. So, that's all I really wanted to cover today. I see someone sent their apologia report too at the time. That's great. Um, Keep me posted as things move along throughout the day. I hope you all have a wonderful day, and I will talk to you here soon. Thanks.